To talk about the new Brazilian president, we welcome from New York, Heloisa Villela. She is a correspondent for Brazilian media. From Miami, economist and author Rodrigo Constantino. Here in our studio, the former director for South America on the White House National Security Council, Fernando Cutz. And also Paulo Sotero, the director of the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Paulo, let's start here in the studio. Let's talk about where Brazil has been, where it's got to, and where it's going to. Broadly speaking, it moved from the left to the right, now to the extreme right. So how significant is this change for Brazil right now?
Very significant. It's a change of direction that Brazil has not had in decades. It reflects a frustration with a statist model that has always existed in Brazil and that is producing benefits to the population. This was identified by Jair Bolsonaro, a backbencher for almost 30 years in Congress. He very ably identified the moment, mobilized support through social media, not through the traditional means, and won decisively an election that was obviously very divisive, but there is no doubt about the legitimacy of his victory and the legitimacy of his government. So he has an opportunity here to assert an agenda that is vast. I think that the center of the agenda is fixing the Brazilian economy that faces enormous challenges in terms of fiscal deficits. This is not in the public's mind very much. This is not in the electoral base of Mr. Bolsonaro, but this is what he has to tackle urgently to do it successfully, including to advance the other part of his agenda. He will be strengthened in power if he shows leadership to advance this agenda in a very fragmented Congress and to start getting results in terms of sustainable economic growth. There is two things going for him: very low inflation and low interest rates by Brazilian standards. So, but the challenge is very, very big, and he has to show that he is a leader.
Rodrigo, Paulo Sotero just outlined the challenges that the new president faces. But, you know, he's been making headlines around the world for some very different reasons. He's been called all kinds of names: a misogynist, a racist, homophobic. He has expressed support for Brazil's former military dictatorship. Given what some people regard as his extreme views, is he going to be able to get the country together, to get rid of divisions in the country, to implement his agenda?
Yeah, I think he will. I think this is a distraction to talk about homophobic behavior and racism. I don't think it's the issue here. I think he has a big challenge in economy. He needs to approve the pension fund reforms and other reforms. Paulo Guedes, he was my boss for 6 years, so I know the guy. He's a very patriot guy, very able economist. He studied in the University of Chicago, Milton Friedman's house. So he has the right recipe for what needs to be done. The big challenge here is execution. And Bolsonaro will have to show that he's able to unite. And when we're talking about union, we are not talking about the worker party. We know that there is going to be a irresponsible opposition. Those guys, those socialist people in Brazil, they were never together with the reforming agenda. Not even in the Plano Real of the Social Democrats. They were always against Brazil. So we cannot count on them. So when we are talking about a union, we are talking about a union not considering, not taking into account the socialists. We cannot count on them. So I think Bolsonaro has to unite the center and the other people that understands the urgency of these economic reforms. These are the priority here. If he doesn't reform the economy, he won't be able to succeed in other areas. I totally agree with Paulo on that.
Heloisa, the big challenge for Brazil, of course, would be getting the economy back on track. But as we just heard, Bolsonaro may have the right recipe. The issue and the challenge will be implementing that recipe. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I've been hibernating for 13, 14 years because I never saw socialism or communism taking hold of Brazil. What I saw was a very tiny little distribution of wealth that took a lot of people out of misery, and people start being able to eat again. But I don't know, maybe that's nowadays called socialism. I'm not so sure. But what we saw yesterday was the beginning of this liberation, because even the minimum salary was reduced already in Brazil. It lost 8 reals from 1,006 reals. It went down to 990 something. So maybe that's the beginning. I'm afraid that, again, the poor people are going to pay the price for whatever magic that they are trying to implement. I don't think that the ideas of the minister Paulo are the best for the country. He believes that this extreme radical liberalism is going to save the country. It's a liberalism. He believes in a liberalism a la Pinochet. He thinks that Chile is the best model. So
Right.
I don't think that's the way to go. But it seems that's the formula they're gonna use, and they're gonna make a socialism or communism the enemy, the phantom that they're gonna fight, although I don't see that it exists in the country.
Heloisa, let me ask you very quickly, and you say that is not the way to go. What is the way to go?
I don't believe that the extreme liberalism that he is proposing is gonna take the country out of the situation it is now. In Chile, it just produced booms and busts, and it didn't produce a steady, sustainable growth with distribution of wealth. And that's what I think we need.
Fernando, let's look very quickly at foreign policy. Brazil, the biggest economy in Latin America, a huge country. President Trump here in the United States has made no secret of the fact that he's a big fan of Jair Bolsonaro. In fact, the president tweeted, "Congratulations to President Jair Bolsonaro, who just made a great inauguration speech. The United States of America is with you." Trump and Bolsonaro share the same views on a number of issues, on things like globalization, on climate change. In fact, Trump got the United States out of the Paris Accord. Bolsonaro has expressed a wish to do the same. How do you see this relationship evolve?
Well, I think that there's 2 aspects of the relationship. The first is the personal aspect, the kind of bilateral, individuals, presidents kind of coming together, and I think that will be just a fantastic relationship. I think there's no doubt that these 2 men are very similar. I think their personalities are similar. I think their policy views are similar. I think the way that they interact with the world around them is similar. They're both very much kind of top-of-mind guys. Will just kind of say what they think, unfiltered, right? And sometimes that's viewed as a positive. Sometimes that's criticized. But what you see is what you get. I worked, directly with President Trump, and I can say that behind the scenes, he's the same guy as he is in front of the cameras. And I think that the same could be said about President Bolsonaro. And so I think they're bound to get together. The other component of that, of course, is the fact that Bolsonaro is referred to as the Trump of the tropics. And I think anybody who is called the Trump of X is somebody that the president automatically takes a liking to. He sees this as a kind of global political movement that he's now helping to start and lead. And so he whether it be AMLO in Mexico or now Bolsonaro in Brazil, he kind of automatically starts to like them more. But then I think the last component, of course, is the actual policy angle.
Right,
and like you said, there's so many similarities there, whether it's the Jerusalem embassy decision that is now kind of reconfirmed by Prime Minister Netanyahu as happening soon, or whether it's the global climate change accords, or whether it's the fact that Maduro and Cuba and the president of Cuba were disinvited from the inauguration by Bolsonaro. These are all, from the United States' perspective, from the Trump administration's perspective, very positive foreign policy signs being exhibited by Bolsonaro.
Paulo, I want to get your take on the man who will lead the battle to get the economy back on track in Brazil, Paulo Guedes, the Minister of the Economy. He's a champion of the free market, as Rodrigo told us. He's from the Chicago School. How does he do it? How does he attract, for instance, foreign direct investment?
Well, he has to tackle the structural reforms that even the trees in Brazil by now know that we need. Brazil is a statist society from the beginning. In Brazil, The state invented the nation. That's why we are full of bureaucracies. We have in the federal system, we have 305 careers. We have hundreds of, more than 100 state companies after many privatizations. So you have to liberate, to free the Brazilian state to its talent.
When you say free the state, are you talking about privatization?
Privatization, you have to make the state smaller and more efficient. It's not a criticism of the bureaucracies. You have brilliant people serving in the permanent bureaucracy in Brazil, but you have to find a way of telling Brazilian and foreign investors, come here, invest here. We have idle capacity in the economy. We have potential has been our middle name forever. We are the largest producers of food in the world.
The thing is, Paulo, as I've said, Paulo Guedes is a big supporter of privatization, of the free market. Would it lead to a better distribution of the country's resources in Brazil?
Depending on how it's done, depending on the details. I think that if you allow the economy to function with less regulation, to create wealth, and then allow...
Doesn't that always make the rich richer?
It does, it tends to do that, but if you do the right interventions, you can sort of contain that side of capitalism, and you can do, I believe, something to resolve the main challenge right now. There were 11 or 12 million jobs lost during the recent recession that was a product of the Dilma Rousseff misguided policies. So here's an opportunity, more jobs, more income to people, and now, Adnan, Brazil is a democracy. We elected a president. We didn't elect an emperor. And he will be challenged and will be constantly reminded by Congress and by a free press what are the challenges. So this is starting a game, and I think there is one important factor going for him. Brazilians have seemed to recover a sense of hope, of optimism that had disappeared in the country. This is positive.
Heloisa, what is your view on that? Is there a sense of hope and optimism in Brazil right now, do you believe?
I don't know. I think there are the people that elected him are certainly very optimistic. The people that did not vote for him, that simply canceled their vote or voted for other candidates, are not very optimistic. But I think that this idea of liberating the economy and reducing the state, and historically has proven only that it makes, as you said, the richer rich and the poorer poorer. Now, the other thing that I think it will be very interesting to see is how he's going to create a sense of unity within his own government, because you're going to have this radical, super liberal guys headed by Paulo Guedes, and you have all these military people that tend to be very nationalistic, that might not be up for all that privatization. And then you have the religious, very religious people. So I don't know how he's going to put it all together. It seems to me that more than the fight with the Congress, he's going to have a huge fight within his own government.
Right, a very diverse coalition. Rodrigo, let me get to you right now. Bolsonaro is, of course, promising big changes. Let's listen to part of what he had to say in his speech.
I'm standing before the nation in this day, when people are starting to get free from socialism, free from upside-down moral values, free from an inflated state machine, and free from political correctness.
So, Rodrigo, is that what Brazilians want? Because there is one view, one analysis of the election says that people didn't vote for him because they like him. They voted for him because they dislike the opposition more. Can he deliver, do you believe?
It's partly true. Brazil was and is a kind of socialist country. For example, in the manifesto of Marx and Engels, there is the fifth item there is to concentrate the credit in the state. 50% of the credit market in Brazil is in the state-owned banks. 50%, half of it. So the level of intervention in the economy is just absurd. We have more than 400 state-owned companies. So Brazil is a socialist country, not to speak of Foro de São Paulo, of the Worker Party supporting Venezuela's model and Cuban model. We were a socialist, almost socialist country. And now we need to unleash entrepreneurship. That's what Paulo Guedes means and Bolsonaro means about getting rid of socialism. We need free market economy. We never had that in our country. And we know for strong economic theory and from facts, historical facts, that's what works. That's what brings people out of poverty. We can look at China now and we can understand better. Millions and millions of people getting out of poverty because of free market measures.
Let me ask you about something else, Rodrigo, and this was a grievance among Brazilian voters, a big grievance, in fact, the endemic corruption in the country. How is he going to tackle that?
The concentration of power and resources in the state is the main reason of corruption, and also not to punish corrupt people. That's what is been tackling by the car wash operation, and Sérgio Moro, the judge, as a minister now, means symbolizes to end this kind of impunity. But corruption means resources concentrated in state. The mechanism of incentives are just terrible if you concentrate power and money in the state. We're talking about distribution of wealth here. If we want to distribute wealth, we need to tackle the privileges. Employees of the state are the ones that concentrate the best benefits and the best wages. So we need to distribute wealth. Okay, let's reduce the size of the government. That's the same recipe here. Everything is together in this kind of recipe.
All right, Fernando, I was reading a piece that you've written, and you say that Bolsonaro's presidency will have many challenges beyond the economy. And, quote, a mishandling of things on the human rights front could be enough to derail a positive market and bilateral environment. You also say that if Trump is not willing to confront Bolsonaro on human rights, the United States Congress and the United States business community surely will.
Absolutely. I think that there is a big concern amongst a lot of folks here in Washington about how Bolsonaro will react to human rights. Specifically, he's made a lot of promises on fighting violence that I think are critical to why he won the election. I think Brazilians are fed up with the amount of violence in the streets, especially in a city like Rio. But it definitely raises concerns. I mean, his liberalization of guns in the streets, his encouragement of police officers to shoot criminals, and his acknowledgement during the campaign that he believes that...
Sounds very much like another leader now.
I'll let others draw comparisons, but you know, he has acknowledged that he believes the only good kind of criminal is a dead criminal. I mean, that's you know, again, we're maybe even beyond President Trump and certainly into President Duterte in the Philippines, right? So the question is, how far does he actually go now that he's in power with some of these things that he's been saying? And if he starts to go down that path, then you have a few challenges in the United States. Of course, there's the presidency, and perhaps President Trump would address it, and perhaps he wouldn't. We've seen that go different ways in different countries. But certainly we have Congress, and we have the business community. And I think if you want to create a positive business environment, and if you want to attract foreign direct investment from the United States, then going down that path is not going to be the way to do it.
Paulo, a quick response from you, because I have a foreign policy question as well.
Yes, there is, Fernando is absolutely right. There will be resistance on human rights, not only in the democratic-dominated Congress here, but also in institutions in Brazil. The Supreme Court will be very attentive in parts of the Congress in Brazil, also in parts of Brazilian society and the press. So Bolsonaro does not have a free hand, a blank check. He is, as I said, he is president of Brazil, depends on how he uses his power wisely to advance his agenda, and I insist the agenda that is important for him to consolidate his power is the economic agenda.
Okay, my foreign policy question, Paulo, is that the new president appears to have taken a very hostile position on China. In many respects, he's echoed President Trump's sentiments.
Yes.
He says China does not want to buy in Brazil, China wants to buy Brazil. I mean, what explains this hostility? I mean, is he aware of the fact that he's talking here about the world's second biggest economy, for one? and a major player in world trade.
And the largest trade partner for Brazil.
For Brazil, right.
That has already signaled to Brazil, careful, don't play with us, because China could find other suppliers to replace Brazil. They have that power. China is becoming an increasingly important actor in certain sectors of infrastructure in Brazil. I think that, and this is sort of, and Fernando and Heloisa know this very well, Brazilians are moderate people. Brazilians are negotiators. I think those positions vis-a-vis China will probably be moderated by the need of Brazil to attract investments, and no country has more capacity to invest, especially in the area that we need most, infrastructure, than China. So I would give this process a few months to continue. One thing that President Bolsonaro will not be able to do successfully is to alienate China. This would be close to...
And also not alienate his agricultural caucus in Brazil.
And that was my next point.
Yeah.
He has in his constituency people telling him, easy with China, they buy everything we produce, they will buy even more. The UN has projections that almost 40% of the added need for food in the next 35 years will probably come from Brazil. So it's a huge opportunity. Imagine, the world is sort of, in part, dependent on Brazil to eat, but you could alienate that if you make wrong choices and if you become very simplistic in choices like the China-US fight is a China-US fight. Brazil has to position itself very carefully in this.
Heloisa, if we look at the rise of Jair Bolsonaro, his emergence as the leader of Brazil, I mean, it's not very different from a trend that's been sweeping the world, it seems. I mean, we've seen the rise of populist right-wing leaders. Well, here in the United States, for one, we have Donald Trump. You have Narendra Modi in India. You've got Marine Le Pen in France, Duterte in the Philippines. How does one explain this phenomenon in Brazil?
I think that what happened in Brazil was a failure of PT that created this phenomenon in Brazil. Now, if I may comment on what you're talking about in the diplomacy and economic relations, sure. I think that diplomatic road that Brazil is taking is going to be limited by its economic necessities. So, for instance, this whole idea of following the U.S. radically and aligning itself straight with the U.S. Can create a lot of problems, not only with China, but with the Middle East. Brazil is the biggest exporter of halal meat, for example, to the Middle East. And what if the countries in the Middle East don't like too much this idea of moving the embassy to Jerusalem? So I think Brazil is going to face a lot of problems in the diplomatic side that's going to affect the economy, or they might end up limiting the diplomatic road that Bolsonaro seems to be willing to take.
Fernando, what's your view on that? Will we see Brazil's foreign policy, or the rhetoric that we've heard during the election campaign, be a little bit moderated, be a little bit tempered now?
Well, I think we certainly will now have an institution, which is their diplomatic corps, which is a very old school, very strong institution that will be pushing back significantly on Bolsonaro, no doubt about that. The question is, how much political capital does he spend, is he willing to spend, to kind of force them along the way? Okay. And again, this is an analogy we can look at President Trump. You certainly had a bureaucracy when he came in that pushed against him in many ways, against many of his campaign promises, including, as we're discussing right now, the move of the embassy to Jerusalem.
Right.
But President Trump kind of used his political might, and he was the president, and he pushed through. So President Bolsonaro certainly could do the same. Now, are there risks diplomatically for Brazil to do something like that? Absolutely. The Middle East will potentially get upset, of course. But there are potential gains as well, right? I mean, you gain a stronger ally in the United States, and I think having a very strong relationship with the United States is something that Brazil has not done in a very long time. And I think there are potential benefits to really kind of that alignment.
Right, and you probably retain the support of your base as well.
Of course.
Great. Paulo, I've got 30 seconds, very quickly.
One thing that the traditional diplomacy in Brazil will find support in the 7 generals that Mr. Bolsonaro invited to be part of his cabinet. These are very institutional people. 2 of them were commanders of UN stabilizing forces in Haiti and in Congo. So there will be a very interesting dynamic.
It doesn't concern you that they're generals?
No. I personally do. I'm not, they returned to the barracks. I don't have any qualms on that regard.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.